Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. I'm so pleased to have Tim Carney back on the podcast. If you recall, the last time he was on High Noon was maybe a year and a half ago when we talked about his book, Alienated America. He now has another book, Family Unfriendly, How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. Timothy Carney, thank you so much for coming back on.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to kick off this discussion actually by talking about a little exchange we had on Twitter that I think really exemplifies a lot of the things that you're writing about in this book. So there was one of those inevitable viral Twitter moments where people split into camps based on who's being the jerk in the situation, right? And to set the scene, there is this is like the video appears to be taken in the afternoon in what appears to be kind of a pub or a kind of Applebee's type bar. You see people with jerseys, with burgers, with beers. There's TVs going in the background, right? And then there is this 40-something woman who is sitting at the bar, comes over to a young woman with a couple of her younger friends, maybe in their 20s, and one of them has a baby. And she just starts screaming at them. She said, "You have a baby in a bar. Take the baby out of the bar." And then the baby starts crying. And then, so what shocked me wasn't, I mean, I don't try to respond to every stupid thing that's on the internet. But what shocked me was that the response from people underneath the video was all in favor of this lady yelling. And they were like, this Applebee's type situation is completely inappropriate to have a child in. And I feel like it's part of what you're writing about in this book, which is that we seem to put young families on a social ice floe and give them very little societal support. So what's the connection between our birth rate and this insane drunk woman in the bar yelling at this poor mother who's trying to pay her bill and have a beer with a couple of her friends?
Well, I'll pile on another sort of Twitter obnoxion story, which is so we just recently got more evidence that school closures were bad for kids emotionally, educationally, and that they probably did nothing or very little to stop the spread of COVID. And immediately the comments started popping back up from those of us parents who were like, yeah, this is why we were fighting the school closures. The comments started popping up that we were getting back in 2020, which is, "Oh, I'm sorry you hate spending time with your kids," or "Thanks for admitting that your kids are harmed by spending more time with you." And I was saying, maybe these are just nasty people on Twitter who just want to make us feel bad, which is obviously true. But also, maybe there is really out there this crazed idea that parenting involves locking yourself in a house with a baby until they're old enough to behave in public, and then you bring them out. And so you see it when parents will show up so apologetically with their baby on an airplane, and they have these little goodie bags for the people around them, which is earplugs and drink tickets. And the parents are trying to be nice, but I hate that idea that we need to apologize for having children in public. And I wonder where it came from. But then these comments on this video made it really clear that there are people who just increasingly think that babies are not to be seen in public, which what goes behind that is that parenting should be just a 24/7 job of being a Secret Service agent for your child. And that is absolutely behind the first two chapters in Family Unfriendly deal with, overambitious parenting and the fear of any little thing happening if you turn your back for half a second. These are crazy ideas, but I think they're definitely behind childhood anxiety, parental stress, and the falling birth rate, because they make parenting impossible.
Well, let's talk about let's back up and talk about the falling birth rate, because it seems like there are often two narratives as to why people are not having kids, at least in the numbers that they used to be. And one is that people simply can't afford it, right? That the economic structure is such that it's very, very difficult to have more than one or two kids. And that's basically like, it's a bunch of people who are relatively well paid sitting around in offices wondering why people who are worried about their next bills are not adding to their families. That tends to be a more left-wing explanation, although I would say, there are definitely people on the right who are more open to discussing matters of political economy and how they interact with the family. all of which I'm not against, but it's never struck me as a complete explanation for some of the reasons in your book. You argue that this is primarily a cultural phenomenon that is accompanied by a series of both cultural and policy choices that go along with that. So what like, broadly speaking, is the case that this is more of a cultural phenomenon than it is an economic one?
I think that's exactly well phrased. I'm not saying economics has nothing to do with it, but it's not true that millennials are poorer than Gen X. The best economists who have looked at this say, you adjust for inflation, look at wealth at a given age, and millennials are on the same track as Gen X, and we had more babies. We, being Gen X, had more babies than the millennials, and then Gen Z. The baby boomers, I don't think were wealthier than the millennials, and the baby boomers had a few more babies than Gen X than millennials are having now. So there's the generational argument. There's the fact that if you go across income quintiles in the U.S., wealthier people don't have more kids. If you get to the super wealthy, yes, they do. But in general, the top 20% have the same number of kids as the middle of the country. Wealthier countries, obviously, are the ones that have the fewest kids. And if you look over just time, in the depths of the Great Recession, Americans were having a lot more babies than they were in 2019 when the economy was the best it's ever been. Full employment, record stock market, low inflation, etc. So all of that says we need something besides the economy to explain the falling birth rates. Another reason to say that it's cultural is you look at Israel. They're wealthy. They are highly educated. They don't have a super expansive welfare state in the way that Northern European countries do. Northern Europe, which gives more money to parents than the U.S. does, has a lower birth rate than we do. And Israel, which gives only slightly more than us and less than the rest of Europe, has a 3.0 birth rate, while Europe is 1.5 for the total fertility rate, and the U.S. is 1.6, 1.7. So the wealth of a country, the wealth of a generation, the wealth of a given year, the wealth of a family, none of those predict birth rates. So that's why you have to look beyond the economic explanation.
Yeah, it also seems to me that like, so I think you put it really well. What's the phrase that you use in this book? I think like an unhappiness.
A civilizational sadness is.
Yeah, that's right. Civilizational sadness involved in you say like, because I really do feel this deeply, but it's very difficult to like to put into like a graph or to really isolate it as a variable. But there does seem, and you bring up Israel, there does seem to be something that is connected to simply not feeling like our civilization is worth perpetuating into the future. On the left, that obviously looks like the kind of new left, late 1960s anti-Americanism. America's a colonial racist power, et cetera, et cetera. We're evil, we're racist, we exist on stolen land. On the right, there's also a kind of doomerism about being that I'm more susceptible to myself, about being in a sort of empire in decline. But there does seem to be this fundamental connection between wanting to survive as the people and civilization that you are now, and the fact that people are declining to do that in most of the Western world, not just the United States.
Absolutely. The relevant question that I think people subconsciously ask themselves, and that you could almost say a culture asks itself, is, are we good? What do we mean by we? Maybe all human beings, maybe hipsters in Brooklyn, maybe white Americans, whatever your we is, you ask, are we good? I think that's a big predictor of your willingness to get married and start a family. So one of the things I point out, I start the chapter on civilizational sadness by discussing how Germany has so many more deaths every day now than births. And that Germany, Japan, and Italy about 15 years ago were really the vanguard in leading birth rates to record lows. And I wasn't the only person who noticed, maybe being on the wrong side of a world war or two can dampen your desire to perpetuate your society. Israel, on the other end, when I went to Israel, I made a point of talking to as many secular Israelis as possible, because obviously the high birth rate in Israel is largely driven by very religious population, and there's a lot of moderately religious population. And I went to a place where I literally ordered a shrimp sandwich on a Friday night, so as unkosher as you could possibly be, and talked to all these people about why Israel has more babies. And one guy said, he's got 3 kids. He said, God has no role in my family planning, but you do have to keep the tribe alive. So that idea of having a people that you love and are proud of. Now, in America, that gets attacked as tribalism. That gets attacked as, nationalism or something like that. So our values have almost made it hard for us to hold on to that idea of we are good. And some of the sort of mainstream media liberal critics of natalism that I cite in the book, they call it like white nationalism puffery to care about babies. And even if you are saying we need more Black and Hispanic and Indian, et cetera, babies, they say it's just white nationalism or something like that. So that idea of having a people that you feel are good, not only is that not felt in the US, it's sort of out of fashion.
Yeah, there's just this feeling that, to discuss it, and it goes back to a little bit of I think, confusion in the United States, rightly, because we don't have the same ethnogenesis as a lot of European nations, right? Even a nation that's admitted a lot of immigration over the years, like France, there is still a concept of like the French nation is the French people, and they can go through different regimes, and they often do. They have through many different regimes, different governments, different structures of governance. But there's this sense of the continuity of the people, the tribe underneath it. The U.S. doesn't have that, and contrary to, I guess, far right white nationalists, I don't know that the U.S. has ever really had it. Although you can argue that it had it more than it does today. But the U.S. has always been like a nations plural, right?
Yes.
Even from the beginning, there have always been multiple first European nations, and of course enslaved Africans with a smattering of others. But then over the years, with large waves of immigration from all kinds of places, it's always been that, there are multiple nations or tribes in the United States, but we had this very, very strong kind of civic sense of nationhood.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely what we've lost. So you really pegged this baby bust, though, kind of to the 2000s, so fairly recently. So you don't like put this as something that's been declining for sort of decades and decades and decades. You point specifically to, I think, that basically we never recovered from the typical bust that would happen in the Great Recession in 2008.
So I will step back a little further because, I think you and I could have a great conversation about tribalism and how America fits with that and how we can't be a tribe of 330 million people. But the closest we ever were to that, I think, was right after World War II. Our men get off a boat. They just defeated 2 evil empires that some people thought were going to take over the whole world. And waiting for them on the pier are the women who just kept the economy going for 4 years. They smooch. They go back to the chapel. They get married. They go home and they make a bunch of babies. The baby boom coincided with the period where sort of the belief in America's goodness was the highest. And then it was totally unprecedented. We never had anything like that in American history. I don't know if it ever happened in European history. It certainly didn't happen after World War II in Europe, where we had a whole generation. It wasn't a makeup for babies lost during the war. It was a whole generation long thing where people were getting married young, having babies, and feeling optimistic about the future. It ends sort of with a snap around the time of the Vietnam War. And I think that, again, points to the goodness. But to fast forward to 2007, one of the stories I tell in the book is when my wife and I had our baby in 2006, and we were stuck in like an overflow wing because everybody was having babies. And all the famous people were having babies. Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes, Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie. I don't know if you remember that period. Every magazine on every week in the supermarket was some celebrity baby being born. My wife and I did not make that cut, but we did help inspire in 2007 the highest number of babies born in American history. And just then the millennials were becoming of baby making age. So we should have had a baby boom, and we didn't. Now, to blame it on the recession is not false, but a couple things. The birth rate kept falling in 2010 and on down, long after we had hit the bottom and things had bounced back up. In 2014, the stock market had doubled, I think twice from the low, and birth rate did not recover. One thing, when I looked at the month by month birth data, I realized that it was the summer of 2008 when we really started having fewer births than 12 months earlier. So that's before the market collapsed. What was it? It was about a year after the iPhone came out. So this is another reason to think this has to do with culture, that our culture has been so transformed by technology, among other forces, and that's one of the things driving the baby bust.
Let's talk about a uniquely American trait, because some of these trends are global, right? You do point to Europe and Southeast Asia mostly being worse off than the United States, primarily because of immigration in the United States, which is not any kind of solution, not only because of the cultural upheaval that it causes, but also because within a generation or two, right? Immigrants' birth rates, it's not like a long-term solution.
Yes.
Right? Immigrants do assimilate, and they assimilate
within one generation.
Yeah, American norms of childbearing. But one thing that is not uniquely American, but is uniquely strong in America, is this double-edged sword of a very individualistic culture. And on the one hand, this is the culture that put us on the moon. America, it's the culture that conquered the West. People, taking their families literally into hostile Indian territory to homestead, where they had not only no community, they had no neighbors for hundreds of miles. That being said, there is a very strong American communitarian tradition as well, and those things coexisted for a long time. We had the individualistic tradition coupled with teeming city blocks full of multi-generational households. In the 1950s, the idyllic suburb sort of American ideal was to send your kids, as you repeatedly say, right, in this book, send your kids out into the neighborhood with all the other neighborhood kids who were there, because the community as a whole was watching over the youth of the entire neighborhood until the streetlights came on. I mean, where did we lose the counterbalance in America to the extent where the individualism that's always been present is now so dominant that, as you point out, people truly do think of forming a family as a totally nuclear activity that should have absolutely no input from the community at large and deserves no input or accommodation from the larger community?
So sometimes I think you could say all of American history is the footnotes to Alexis de Tocqueville, because what you were describing there, the communitarianism and the individualism, that's the tension that Tocqueville writes about in Democracy in America. And it's absolutely true that that all the most individualistic Europeans a few hundred years ago got on a boat and came over here. But it's also absolutely true that, as Tocqueville points out, that nobody in the world does as much like, hey, let's get together and fix this problem as Americans do. We're not as likely to rely on the state historically. We didn't have feudal lords that we relied on. But also there has been a steady march towards this idea of hyper-individualism, and that just doesn't fit with family. And in fact, the people I quote making that point in Family Unfriendly tend to be more liberal women who are, maybe they're arguing for government intervention on behalf of families, but certainly they're saying the way I put it is, the logic of capitalism has crept into our social arrangements, that we sort of think that family stuff should be transactional, that the nuclear family should be sufficient to raise kids, especially because nowadays getting married and having kids isn't just something you do. It used to be something you do, you can opt out, fine, but it's a natural course of event. But now it's something so intentionally, deliberately chosen. It's agonized over, it's postponed, it's chosen. So now it's your problem. So that's the mindset that I think makes it really hard for families, because again, you feel like you're imposing if you show up somewhere with your kids, because adults know how to respect people's personal space. There's nothing that's not consented to. No, not everything's a transaction. Kids don't work in that way. And so I really think that it's been a slow and steady creep of an individualism that undermines the family. And some people say that you could read the Little House on the Prairie, great American series, as actually a refutation of that, because they don't thrive when it's just Pa and his axe building the house. When do they thrive? It's when they get more embedded in a community.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great piece that Helen Roy wrote for Blaze. I don't know if you saw it, but she characterizes millennials, like her, like myself, as essentially when they do have kids, being in the business of constructing the village, that is very, very intimidating. That essentially, and she does blame in part boomers for. And this is maybe, and maybe it's in, I only got full disclosure to the audience. His book came out today. It's fascinating. I've gotten about 2/3 of the way through it. So maybe you get to this in the last third. But millennials are the first generation, I think, to Gen X arguably, but I think millennials more strongly really come from a very high percentage of like breakdown of the family in that community that you're talking about, where there's an extraordinarily high percentage of divorce among boomer parents, right? The highest in American history. So you have more and more people coming from split households. You do have fewer siblings, right? So there isn't, and then of course you have the inexorable march of falling away from religious community, which seems to be a related but sort of separate phenomenon. So the number of people my age who have divorced families, who don't have, let's say, an extended network of siblings and their, their children or their spouses, right, are not part of a regular religious community. They are in the position of building the village, and that's like a very difficult thing to do, because as you say, there's an aspect of it that's unchosen. But for a lot of millennials, the unchosen reality they've been bequeathed is one without a village.
Yes. So, and in fact, here in the DC area where I live, in New York, where I'm from, if you talk to sort of my peers, journalists or, think tank types or Capitol Hill staffers, a lot of times there's a pride that's what growing up was about, outgrowing your roots. So it'll be some journalist who's from Woodburn, Indiana, who's just so proud to be out of Woodburn and to be above and beyond his upbringing, which was based in religion, et cetera. That's what a lot of people think adulthood is deracinating yourself, the taking a plant and pulling it up from its roots. And only then, when its obligations are all chosen, and ideally they're not obligations, but they're transactions, only then are you actually free. So that idea of freedom is part of the problem. But then you go ahead and you build your own little village. And again, that should all be chosen. I always contrast, in this mindset, this modern mindset, which I think is wrong. I always loved the movie Gone Baby Gone, where the first line is Casey Affleck saying, "I always thought it was the things you didn't choose that make you who you are." And that's an older idea, when community was available to the middle class and the working class by stepping out the front door. And I think about what my wife and I do. We're in the DC area. We're in one part of Northern Virginia. We send our daughters to a Catholic school out in another part. We send our boys to a Catholic school in Maryland. And our youngest, she's able to walk to school, thankfully. But we work really hard to piece together this village, which is of unimaginable value to us. But we're able to do it because my wife stays at home. She's from here, so she's massively connected to everybody else. We now have a daughter who can drive. We're able to afford 3 cars. All of these things, we have to sort of buy into a village. So we're not assembling it from scratch because we're Catholics and we belong to these institutions, but we are piecing it together. Now imagine somebody who doesn't have religion or who doesn't have the resources. It's so much harder for them to have that supportive village for raising children.
Well, so what I guess then are some of your suggestions, both on the societal level and how we might build some of those societal supports? Because it seems like we are starting both on the personal level for a lot of people, but certainly on the societal level with not a lot of structure that's inherently in place. And in fact, actually something maybe that you can address further is we have even less structure than that sort of parents can count on than previous generations, because all of those, even more recent, because all of those institutions that survive that kind of atomization, like the public school, the library, those now in this highly ideological environment, I mean, those are institutions that parents have to protect their kids against in many cases. So even those real basic community systems, like, being able to send your kid to the neighborhood school, those are not available the way they even were 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. So what are some of the suggestions that you would give people about building a village? Because that's really what a lot of people are in the position of doing. They're not born into one the way that you and your wife have been, fortunately.
So first of all, I know people who have moved. I mean, if we're talking about conservative people who don't want their children being preached gender ideology and, an indelible mark of guilt for being white, etc. I know people have just moved. They've left Northern Virginia. They've left the New York suburbs, and they've gone to Tennessee, Texas, or Florida, and they send their kids to public schools, and that's one blessing. Now, that's horrible if that means moving away from your parents or your brothers and sisters, because that is the real village, like anthropologically speaking, is embedding yourself with cousins and in-laws, and just statistically, grandparents helping raise the kids is one of the biggest things that helps people have as many children as they want. You're more likely to have the second kid if your immediate family helps you with your first kid. Israel, with its high birth rate, 70% of mothers get help from their mothers versus 35% in Europe. So what's the advice? So I'm giving conflicting possibilities. One is get up and move. Two is just there's nothing that beats family. So that might be your village. Live close to your parents, live close to your siblings, ideally live next door. Now that's impossible for me. I live in Northern Virginia. If I could find any house, I'd be happy. I'm not in a position to buy the house next door to my in-laws. But just belonging and volunteering. If I were to write like a strategy guide for how to get a village, well, think about what you want to do, what you like doing. For me, it would be baseball. Go, and I talk in the preface of the book about starting a T-ball team. Or if you move into a town and it has a decent little league, volunteer, get on the board, start, work in the snack shack every week. Then try to nudge it and say, hey, can we stop the intensive travel ball stuff and just go back to being a neighborhood thing? If there are institutions that exist, join them, sign up. And when you've put in a little bit of blood, sweat, and tears, you can then nudge them towards being less achievement obsessed and more community obsessed.
So let's talk about sports, because you use baseball a lot in this book as an example of what can go wrong, what can go right in these kinds of community supports. And this is part of perhaps maybe where I didn't fully agree. So I think I grew up in a community that was very, very much like what you're describing. And with a lot of your critiques of it, I agree. And I've written my own critiques of Palo Alto in part, I think, or at least centrally, the critique that material success has outstripped all other values. There is essentially the bottom has fallen out, where the primary investment in childbearing is to garner the correct, list of accomplishments to get into the top university. And that doesn't do well either for the parents who are very, very stressed, or for the kids who, if they inevitably fail, and if you are working towards being the top, let's say the top shortstop in the state, as you imagine in your book, 99.9% of kids are not going to be the top shortstop in the state.
Yep.
But so I guess the counterpoint, though, when I look back at my childhood, I see it more as a lack of the other things that you are referencing here in terms of, emphasis on character, on virtue, on becoming like a good, virtuous member of society that actually can invest in your own community and create your own family and be like a positive to those around you. That's what was missing. Not so much the rigorousness of the
You don't
sports.
think
Out of all the things that I didn't like about how I grew up in that like rat race environment, I think like being forced into a really rigorous schedule with sports, and to get good at something that I wasn't like naturally, I was never going to be like recruited or any of those things. And my parents never pushed me to be that way. But in order to compete at all, I mean, I played year round. I, invested probably in some cases 30, 40 hours a week, in high school in sports. And when I look back, I think that was really valuable. Like the rigorousness, not just the fun that I had playing the sports, but the requirement of like dedicating hours and hours and hours to something that you were maybe like mediocre at and becoming pretty darn good at it, even if you weren't number one, was really valuable in terms of like being able to focus for long periods of time, learning how to work with different people, all the things that parents would hope, not crazy parents, but like just ordinary parents would hope their kids actually do learn from sports or other organized activities.
I think this is probably the biggest pushback I've received from people who've read the book. Somebody said our marching band was awesome and we had to practice a ton, and I don't even play the flute anymore, but learning to play with others, learning that really putting in time allows you to improve is a virtue. I absolutely agree with all of that. What I'm focusing on in chapter 1 with what I call the travel team trap is, one, specialization where can deprive you of a more expansive childhood. It can mean, so there was a kid my son used to play baseball with. His parents owned a lake house, and they said, oh, well, we don't really get to use it in the summer because Will's playing travel ball all summer. I think a kid playing in the lake for at least 1 month in the summer, if you have the resources to do that, that's amazing. That would be great. And I think that the specialization, it can lead to injuries. Or I quote the NBA commissioner saying 18-year-old kids are showing up with bodies that show the wear and tear usually of somebody in their 20s. And the psychological thing, maybe you were insulated by not believing you were going to be the star. What was it? Field hockey? What were you playing?
Oh, no. I played basketball. I mean, I started out the way that you did. I played like all kinds of sports. By the time you get in middle school, though, I guess
that's a generational thing.
You have to specialize, and because it just takes up too much of your time to get good at any one of these sports. And I chose basketball, and I basically that
specialization is I think that started with the millennials. The story I tell in the book is of the one guy who specialized. He gave up his third best sport. He kept playing basketball. Pete Zuccolillo gave up soccer, and that was a huge deal. It made the local papers that he gave up soccer because he was being recruited by a semi-pro team and being scouted by D1 scouts. He ended up being an All-American and making the major leagues. Those were the only guys who specialized, and they specialized in their senior year, not in middle school. And that, I think, the upside is just learning that if you apply yourself to something, you get good at it. And the risk is that, again, that you feel really down about yourself, because if your parents built their whole life around you're excelling at basketball, and then one day you're like, I'm still not that good, that could really lower your own, through the opposite of what you're talking about. So I absolutely believe trying hard and getting better and all of that stuff can be part of the specialized sports. But I think turning a game into a job has a real unfortunate aspect to it. And a job is another thing. It's harder. One reason that kids today are less likely to have jobs when they're in high school is because they're specializing, is because they're getting the extra tutoring and all of that stuff. And for me, working at the Pelham Picture House in Pelham, New York, and going, finishing my varsity game, rushing home, showering, and going to the movie theater, that was its own great experience of having responsibilities, not just assignments. So I want more expansive childhood is what I'm arguing for. So it's not a all in all. I wouldn't, in fact, outlaw travel sports, but I would try to move people more towards dabbling and less towards a specialization.
I guess I just think, and maybe this is very individual to the child, but I mean, I feel like as a teenager and a lot of my friends and me, like we had already had like what do you call it, like an inclination to dabble, right?
Mm-hmm.
To go from one thing to the other and not actually master anything. And so like in my case,
that's what I see adulthood for.
Negative, because I would have like never learned to actually stick with something long enough to really improve at
Being
it.
a lifelong dabbler would be a problem, and it's something I worry about.
I am still a bit of a lifelong dabbler in many ways, but
isn't that what having a podcast is for?
Yeah,
is
exactly. That's why I like
book you want to
read.
read.
All these different people about different things. But I mean, I do think anyway. Like I definitely see what you're saying. I guess I always read it as more of a problem of a lack of any other source.
You're right.
Of value. And you talk a lot about this in the more like philosophical way in this book, that we have moved from valuing human life and particularly children in themselves to essentially a roster of their accomplishments. And you rightly point out, what happens to the kids who don't have that, whether it's because they're not the all-star, or something, much more unavoidable and tragic, like having severe disabilities. What like value does that child have in a society that essentially views children as resume lists?
No, that's really well
views
put.
Adults that way.
Yeah, and so I start chapter 1 quoting my 12-year-old son's coach saying, "Baseball isn't fun. Winning is fun." And so if my book has bad guys, it's like Paul Ehrlich and this one coach. These are the two bad guys in the book. And I end chapter 1 by talking about family members of mine, children who were born with disabilities, either Down syndrome or my nephew, John Paul, who died of spinal muscular atrophy and was never able to walk or speak. And I say that if you look at their parents, if you talk to their parents and you take in the experience they have, that gives you an insight into what you can see in your children, no matter what. So I end it by turning the coach's saying on its head and expanding and saying, successful kids aren't good. Kids are good. But that requires, and so we haven't really talked about religion yet, but that is much more present in a society that has a supernatural view, that believes in God, that believes that humans are something besides just what we physically or historically add to the world. And so in a secularized America, I think it's inevitable that we would become more utilitarian in our assessment of people. And so that makes it so much easier. So I can still argue on utilitarian grounds that people are good, and I do in the book, but it's so much easier for the climate doomists, the climate doomers, the 1619 project types, etc., to win that argument and say, actually, people are bad. Once we've removed any spiritual value of a human being, it's a more even match between the pro-human folks and the anti-human folks.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not a coincidence that most of the communities that you go to interview, where you do find larger families and more thriving community, most of those are religious pockets, right? You talk about Mormons in Utah and Idaho, Orthodox Jews in Maryland. Israel is a bit of the outlier again on a lot of these things, and because a large part of the society is very secular. Yes, there's the Orthodox part of the society that is having many more kids, but the secular Israeli society is also well above replacement rate. I mean, it really is sort of 3 is the 1.5 for secular Israeli families. And I noticed that even in Palo Alto growing up, which is, again, very much everything that you were describing. The only families in sort of Silicon Valley, wealthy suburbs that have more than 2 kids were Jewish families, who would have 3 or 4 kids. Uh, and I really do. I mean, I don't think it's duplicable in America because I really do think it comes down to tribalism. It's 2 for us, 1 for the tribe. And
Well,
that's not going to happen in America.
so I think tribalism is an aspect of it. The image I construct of Israel's culture is one of a garden. And actually, I've asked my brother John, who uses Mid-Journey, the AI image generator, to try to come up with an actual graphic depiction of this garden that I'm imagining. The middle center tree of Israeli culture is religion. That is what sets the tone. Lots of people eat of that tree. God's first commandment, the first mitzvah, as a lot of the people I spoke to said, was be fruitful and multiply. The other 2 big trees there, one guy said, well, I'm not religious, but you have to keep the tribe alive. So the tribe, meaning the Jews, Israel historically, going back to Exodus, the multiple attempts to actually eliminate them, attempts that could have succeeded. And so perpetuating that's another tree. The third tree is their current geopolitical situation. And I wrote this even before the October 7th attacks, but under threat from, you got Syria, you've got Lebanon, you've got Hamas. And so under these threats, these trees provide fruit, but also they provide shade. They provide habitats for other animals. You got birds, grass is going to grow underneath it. All of these things make it just broadly a good habitat for children. And so somebody said it to me, in Israel, the bus drivers have an affection for little kids. That was his way of describing how thoroughly the pro-family culture is. You bring your kids to the restaurant. People have kids, and people have kids everywhere. They have them in the restaurants. They have them on the bus. They have them on the airplanes. The culture just broadly tries to accommodate kids. You build a new housing project, it's going to have playgrounds in the middle. It's going to have a kindergarten. Try to make things kid walkable, not just hipster walkability, but kid walkability, so the kids can go out on their own. All of that radiates out of religion, basically, and it infects the non-religious.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I also think that there are certain features of Judaism that remind me how it is that Jews have survived through so many different empires and through so many different, assuming one does not take the religious view that God simply protects them and comes to their aid when the different nations rise up to destroy them. But from a sociological perspective, there are certain features of Judaism that make it compatible with postmodernism in a way that other religions, I think, struggle in modernity. One of those is not an incredible focus on belief as much as practice. The orthopraxy of Judaism makes it more compatible, I think, with people who are inherently, like in the modern age, are sort of
more skeptical.
Death of God skepticism is, you can still be a good Jew and keep your private skepticism, which is not something that is possible in less orthopraxic religion. So I think there's some, and then of course there is this like very intense and complicated relationship between the religion of Judaism and the people, the tribe associated with it. I mean, these are like very complicated questions. They're in some ways, very personal for me. I don't know if you know this, but my parents lived in Israel for 11 years, 10 years before they moved to the United States. So like, I think of it as a unique set of incentives for a variety of reasons that I don't see being replicated in the United States, for better or for worse. But I do want to finish up by talking about something where I very, very much agree with you, perhaps for more hipster reasons, as you just said, which is you talk about the actual physical structure of American life. And by that, I mean the suburbs, and how that makes it particularly difficult actually to raise a family, even though the traditional American suburban idea is that you get more space, right? That if we sprawl out from the cities, that the middle or working class family who has 2 or 3 kids will be able to find a 3-bedroom place with enough space for every kid to have their own room and so forth in the American dream, right? But you point out that this American dream for families has gotten a little bit nightmarish in terms of some of the downsides of suburbia as it's currently constructed.
Yes. So I use the word car hell. And there's this part of being a parent. I mean, when you might have 3 different kids who have to go into car seats. Now, first of all, to even have 3 kids, you have to buy yourself a 3-row car, because there's actually a study showing that the car seat mandates tended to prevent people from having a 3rd kid because you couldn't fit a 3rd car seat. So you buy this, Honda CRV or something.
Wait, don't gloss over. I don't want to interrupt you, but don't gloss. Can you lay that out for people? Because I found it so incredible how something so small could impact. And it's really, the data is really convincing that this, as you lay it out, that this is in fact the reason that a lot of people did not have a 3rd child.
The study is called Car Seats as Contraception. And what it looked at was how there's no federal car seat mandate, or at least not at first. It was state by state. It was rolled out. And they found, and so first of all, just if you've never done this yourself, in the backseat of a Toyota Camry, of your standard sedan, you could fit 2 car seats. You certainly can't fit a 3rd. You can't even fit 2 car seats and a booster seat. So I once had to ride in a car between my 2 nephews, and it was incredibly uncomfortable, in addition to being kind of gross. But then, what the study did is it looked at whether birth rates changed before and after these mandates went into effect. They found that it did, but that change, the drop was entirely among married couples with 2 kids. So in other words, it was people who used to be able to fit 5 people in a car and now could only fit 4. And so they argue that it barely saved any lives in car accidents, just because they're installed imperfectly. Other safety measures are saving lives, etc. And so it barely saved any lives, but it prevented tens and hundreds of thousands of births by doing this. So, but then there's just the pain of getting your kids in and out. The way I think I remember it, it's just like you have to dig your hands under your kid's sweaty butt and pull out the little buckle, and you come out, and under your fingernails now there's like a mixture of goldfish and crackers and butt sweat and baby saliva, and then buckle them, and then you have to unbuckle them and buckle them. If you stop at more than one place, it's totally impossible. And they're probably not potty trained, and even when they are, then as soon as you get it, buckle them in, they have to go. So cars are actually more unpleasant for families, but families, especially with little kids, become totally dependent on the car. So if you don't have something that's walking distance where you can push a stroller or walk with your toddler, if all of their friends, even if it's walking distance, a lot of the suburbs are built so that it's just not safe to walk there. Where I used to live in Maryland, it was 3-4 lanes in either direction to get to the grocery store that we could see from our house. I'm pretty free range. I would have let them walk to the grocery store at 7 or 8, but crossing the street involved identifying who was probably going to blow that red light, who was going to come and not slow down before taking that right on red, and just these massive roads. And so we didn't let them walk to the grocery store until later. So walkability is something that I used to think was a silly sort of liberal hippie concern. And then once I started having kids, I just thought my ability as a kid to walk and bike all over my hometown was absolutely liberating for me and for my parents. My need to drive my kids to places, either because they're far away or because the streets aren't safe to cross, that's absolutely oppressive. The kids get less fun, and the parents are strapped to the kids at all points.
Yeah, you point out here that there are just outside of some of these communities that you interviewed, and then your own experiences with the parish that you're with, and the families that you are friends with around who have very similar values, and you've really been able to create this for yourself, or in fact half created for yourself through choice and half inherited from on the basis of who you are, unchosen, right? One thing that's very much in common in all of these communities that you interview are places where you can just drop the kids together and not have to pay all that much attention. Right.
Yep.
That, in fact, that there might be a lot of virtue to being, as a parent, to being able to just know that, your kids are not in inherent danger unless somebody comes home, screaming and bleeding excessively, like that. Basically, you can do other things or turn your attention to other things, like interacting with adult human beings who might actually share some of your more adult interests, like holding a conversation not about goldfish.
Yeah, and so that's why I referred to T-ball. The T-ball League I started at St. Andrews, my old Maryland parish, started because our priest asked me, what do the people here need that the parish could provide them that the rest of the world isn't providing them? And I said, a place to bring our children and ignore them while we hang out with other adults. And I think I used the term semi-legal alcohol. Like, you can have a beer, the church isn't supposed to give it to you or know you're having it, but you're not going to get in trouble while watching a Friday night T-ball game. I talk about this one street that I call Pearl Place, where all these college buddies who are in our social circle, they all moved, and just nobody knows where their kids are most of the day. That's a quote from a guy in a kibbutz in Golan Heights, said, "Here you don't have to raise your children." Now, English was his second language, so I think it came out a little overstated, but the idea was that they're running around with that sort of freedom. And that involves all sorts of things, including just as you said, the physical built environment being pro-kid.
Well, let's finish on this, because part of that kind of environment that you were talking about involves mixing between people in different stages of life.
Yes.
As well, right? And that's something that, again, we're talking about the differences between America and some other countries, even countries that have lower birth rates than we do. It is more extreme, that kind of social segregation between families with, like, kids, let's say between 0 and until they get up into the teenage years, like until they're in high school, basically. I've never encountered or lived around a culture, and I've lived around a few, with more social segregation of families than modern upper class American culture today. There really is, like, this, even physically, right? We send them out to the suburbs, where, as you say, there's not a lot of community life left, both for atomization reasons, cultural reasons, but also physical reasons, because it's difficult to get anywhere without a car, and everybody's scheduled and so on.
But the scheduledness is what's behind that. Because when one of my favorite things to do is when I get to walk my youngest daughter to school, we run into basically the old ladies who are going for morning walks, and nothing makes them happier than seeing my 7-year-old. And then I realize they might, on a day-to-day basis, not get 7-year-olds with dimples. And then you think about how much a kid would learn from their grandparents, and then how much they need sort of mixed age play. So to some extent, you were even just describing like the backyard barbecues where everybody's the same age and at the same stage in life. But also kids are getting that in a more extreme version, where if everything's scheduled and planned, they're only playing with people who are born within 12 months of them on either side. And there's so much that's lost from that. So this is one of the blessings of a big family is, my 13-year-old has to play with my 7-year-old and so on. But also, the more organic a community is, the more random and unchosen your interactions are, the more you're going to have the age mixing, and that's really beneficial to everybody involved. That's actually a great point now. I wish I had emphasized it even more in my book.
Yeah. So given the fact that it is so, I guess, one, why do you think it is that segregated in the United States? Because even in other wealthy countries that have similar problems with birth rates, and a lot of this stuff applies, and rigorous educational standards and so on. I mean, it is just not as uncommon, even in Paris,
I think that
you go to like a restaurant
Yeah.
at 9 p.m., you're going to see families in the restaurant. And in America, it's just you take your kids to Chuck E. Cheese and that's it, because everywhere else is either going to be mad at you for going or vice versa. Like there just doesn't seem like an interest. A lot of families are very, very isolated in their own home or their own set of activities, and like they're not interacting with the broader community at all.
Maybe we're more planners, and that's why. And if you live in a city, no matter what, it's going to be a little more on serendipity. Americans, we have more space than Western Europe, and so we think we can sort of choose and where we live, etc. And it's easier to choose. When you choose, it's easier to self-segregate. When you're not choosing, you're more likely to be mixed up. So that would be my guess. But I love the fact that we started with a baby in the bar and now we're at a baby in a bistro.
Yeah. Yeah, these are my concerns. No, but I think it's not just about obviously the bar and the bistro, right? It is about not isolating young families from people who are older or younger than them. And a lot of American cities do feel, and this is very recent, feel like playgrounds for single or married people from the age of 18 to 22 coming out of college through about 40. And I call it like millennial summer camp. Like DC feels very much like that to me, right? You have the interns through like mid-career professionals, and everybody who has a family escapes into the surrounding suburbs. And so like you really can't, I don't think it's good for us broadly, even being in that cohort myself, it makes you really intolerant.
You can go all day without seeing a kid. So when the kid does step into your coffee shop,
just I could in DC, and New York's a little different, and I actually really like that. It's more organic in that way. But DC, when I lived in DC, not forget a day, like I could go a week and see nobody younger than 22 and nobody older than 40.
Yeah, and sometimes I say, think about the fact that our congressional staffers could do that too. That a 28-year-old chief of staff to a 35-year-old member of Congress, they might go all day not seeing children or old people if they live in U Street and ride the metro and work all day on Capitol Hill. And they're the ones who are making a lot of the policy, and that can have effects if children aren't in your mind. And so this is a way that the falling birth rates beget falling birth rates. And you see it in South Korea, where there's more and more no children allowed signs, because the one kid a week that shows up in the coffee shop makes everybody freak out. And so the segregation leads to more segregation because, as you're saying, it creates an intolerance.
Yeah, there's plenty of policy suggestions, from zoning laws to tax credits, but there's also so much both personal narrative, and one of the things that I admire about Tim is he is, both as a journalist and as a writer, author of books, he always is very upfront in disclosing all of his quote unquote biases, which are just his life in this case. Like, yes, I'm a Catholic guy with 6 kids. Like, this is my perspective. But in this book, there are interviews with just about every type of person, and I think this is a remarkable book. I think this goes along very, very well with kind of a reconsideration, I think, especially after post-pandemic life, of what we're going to value as a society and how we're going to structure. I mean, there is an opportunity in being cut off from tradition as well, which is we have both the tragedy and the opportunity to build something, to build a village. So highly recommend this book. I'm going to finish the last third of it. But Tim Carney, thank you so much. Where can people buy Family Unfriendly? Where can people find your work?
On sale everywhere. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, should be in all the bookstores. AEI.org and the Washington Examiner. Those are the 2 places where you'll find my work.
Thanks so much, Tim, for coming on again.
Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to inez.stepman@iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.